Hey guys, I'm Andrey and you're welcome to another video on King's Gambit. In the previous videos we have covered some interesting lines of King's Gambit accepted. Now it's time to switch to the classical variation, which starts after e4, e5, f4, and here instead of doing something like e takes f4 or any other pawn move, black just develops the bishop to c5. First of all, what is the idea behind it? Obviously, we develop bishop and we occupy one of the diagonals which was weakened after white's f4. In addition to h4, e1, a7, g1 is also quite weak. So now the bishop controls it. It also controls d4 square, preventing white from playing d2, d4 easily. And the tactical justification for this bishop to c5 is that white cannot really take e5 right now. For example, if white does that, here comes queen h4 check, and black attacks the king and e4 simultaneously. Something like king to e2 would be just awful because black has the access to e4, and after queen takes e4 is just a checkmate. And if white does something like g3 here, then after queen takes e4, the rook drops. For instance, if after queen e4, white tries to trap the queen after queen to e2, queen captures on h1. And white plays on like knight to f3. So now, as you may notice, the queen is quite limited there, but white doesn't really have a chance to attack the queen with the bishop g2 because this bishop is pinned. So black just continues his development with natural moves like knight c6. After something like d3, black may do different things. One of them is just to play d5, occupying the center. And after white captures en bateau, it's possible to move the king to f8. So the idea behind this last action is simple. Black just decided to open the position because king and the queen occupy the same file, and it's possible to bring the bishop to active position to g4 quickly, followed by rook e8. In addition to the extra rook, it should be just a winning position. So let's get to bishop c5 moment and see what white can do there. So, after bishop to c5, taking into account the problem with the e4 pawn and h4 square, white should rather continue with the natural knight to f3 move, developing the knight, and attacking e5 the second time. Black normally protects the pawn, so the point here is that taking on e5 twice is still bad because of different reasons, including this queen h4 and also queen to d4 if necessary. I mean fe5, d5, knight e5 and queen d4 looks also pretty interesting for black. So here white may try different things. The least attractive is probably d4, because after d4 move it starts looking like, you know, Scotch a little bit, but a pretty good version for black. After e takes d4 and knight takes d4, as you may notice, white, instead of making some useful moves, actually made this not very logical f4, weakening a lot of things, including e4 pawn. So black simply continues with a knight f6 here, attacking e4, and after, say, knight to c3, simple castling. And it's already not so clear how to protect e4 because rook e8 is coming. There are various sacrifices possible on e4 followed by d5, let's say. And there is also a problem with a7, g1 diagonal. So white has problems with castling as well as with something like bishop e3. So everything will be quite vulnerable in this diagonal. So it's not good for white. Let's get back to the moment after d6. So another option is to develop the bishop to c4. Which pretty quickly starts looking like Vienna game, which is out of the scope of this video. So black may continue with the knight to f6, counter-attacking e4. White normally responds with the knight c3. After knight to c6, it's possible to play d3. And one of the possibilities for black here is to play knight to a5, starting the attack against the bishop, which normally leads to grabbing the bishop and getting the pair of bishops. While white is going to enjoy a better presence in the center. So normally after something like bishop to b3, knight takes b3, a takes b3 and a6, preparing a nice square a7 for the bishop, position is more or less balanced. So now let's get back to a critical test of the classical variation. It is the c3 move. So right after d6, white plays c3, preparing d4. So white is not going to play d4 right now immediately, but after c3 with the intention to build up a very strong pawn center. It's interesting that black cannot really prevent it, even if he wants, but the thing is, black actually wants white to play d4 because these central pawns become quite vulnerable. So black continues with the normal development move knight to f6. White obviously tries d4. After e takes d4, white recaptures with a pawn, and the bishop steps back to b6, although bishop b4 checks is also possible. But bishop b6 looks a bit more natural because, well, bishop actually went to c5 to control this diagonal a7, g1. And now after cd4, since d4 can be no longer protected by pawns from adjacent files, this pawn will be an object of attack. Whenever it moves, for example, this bishop will be extremely active. So after bishop to b6, it's important to realize that something like e5 is possible immediately. After d takes e5, obviously d captures e5 is quite bad for white because of simple exchange of queens. Queen takes d1, king takes d1, and here the bishop comes in handy. So the knight jumps to g4, creating a threat of knight f2. And king to e1 looks like the only sensible move, preventing the immediate material losses, but then simple knight to c6 gives black an amazing position. Now, in addition to some threats on f2 and e3 squares, black has also an option of bringing the knight to b4, attacking c2 and d3. Black is doing really well here. So after capture on e5, white has to recapture with the f pawn, and this looks pretty good at first, but in fact, black has sufficient resources to parry any possible activity. So d takes e5, f takes e5, then knight goes to d5. So this pawn structure looks pretty good for black. White's pawns are quite active, but they're also vulnerable, especially the d4 one, and the fact that there are no pawns on e and c files controlling d5 square makes this an amazing spot for the knight. So white may continue with the knight to c3, exerting some pressure. And here black tried different things, but it feels like the best stat is after bishop to e6 move. Simply protecting the knight, even overprotecting it, preparing some like queen to d7, controlling the light squared complex, followed by knight to c6 at some point, preparing the play against d4 pawn. So black is doing good here. That means that immediate e5 is not so dangerous, and white should try something different. So here, the choice is not so wide, e4 is hanging, so the most logical move is to play knight to c3. Where after black castles, and now white has different possibilities. So it's possible to start the active play with the e5. It is also possible to play bishop to d3, trying to develop the pieces in a normal way. Let's start with the bishop to d3. So bishop goes to d3, protecting e4 and preparing castling. Knight goes to c6, attacking d4 pawn. That is one of the drawbacks behind bishop d3, so queen no longer controls d4 square. Now to protect the pawn, white has to make an ugly move. So any move will be ugly here. Bishop e3 looks good, at least from the point of view that says that we have to make useful moves, we have to continue with the development and so on. But the problem is that this bishop is quite vulnerable here on e3, and it becomes clear pretty quickly. So we can play rook to e8, controlling the e file additionally. And now if white plays, let's say, e5, we just take on e5. It's clear that d takes e5 is no longer possible because bishop is hanging on e3, so f takes e5 is literally forced. But it appears it's not even a threat because bishop on e3 is not protected, so we may ignore the hanging knight on f6. It's not really hanging right now. Instead, we may develop our bishop to g4, pinning the knight and creating a threat to d4 pawn. It's no longer so simple to protect it. White may try bishop b5, pinning our knight, which attacks d4, but then we simply move the knight from f6 to d7, and we have a bunch of different threats, including bishop takes f3, followed by knight takes d4, if queen recaptures on f3. Another potential threat is just to take e5 with the knight, because both the knight f3 and pawn d4 are pinned, so pawn on e5 is also hanging here. This is a very good position for black. What if white just castles instead of playing this pseudo-active e5 move. Let's say in this position, after black played rook to e8, white is simply castling. So now bishop no longer has g1 square to step back, and black may continue with the knight to g4, attacking it. Bishop cannot go away because d4 will drop in that case. So the only sensible move here is to play something like queen to d2. We may take the bishop, and after that we can continue with a very nice little combination. So now dark squares are super weak in white's camp, and black may take d4. After knight takes d4, black continues with the attack against d4, using the power of the bishop on b6. So now white has different options to try to save the material, but neither works really well. For instance, if white plays knight to e2, the most natural move just protecting the knight, black has very simple c5, attacking the knight d4, and the problem for white here is that if knight goes away, there is c4, attacking the bishop and the queen simultaneously. So most likely white is just losing material here. Another option is to play active knight to d5 move, in which case we simply take on d4 with the queen, and after queen takes d4, bishop takes d4 comes with check, so white has no time to take the pawn on c7. And after something like king to h1, we have a simple way to protect it by just moving the bishop away to b6. So now white will have some sort of compensation for missing pawn, but anyway, it's just an extra pawn for black. Finally, if white tries to play something like e5 against queen to f6, it also doesn't work really well. So let's get back to that position. And after e4, e5, black may simply capture on e5. And after f takes e5, black can also exchange queens. That is interesting. So white is forced to take on e5 because both the knight and the queen are hanging, so queen e5. Then rook captures on e5. Pay attention that black already has 2 pawns for a sacrificed minor piece, and knight on d4 is still hanging. The only reliable defense here is knight to e2, because at least here the knight, is more or less protected. Here black has different options. For example, bishop g4 may be interesting. C5 move may be also interesting. Something like, starting with rook e3 may be interesting. What is really cool, black may even try something like rook takes e2, sacrificing the exchange. So after bishop captures on e2, and bishop captures on d4 with check, forcing the king to h1, black simply continues with bishop to e6, let's say, just completing the development and controlling the diagonal g8, a2, and then, for instance, supports the bishop on d4 with a c5. So even this position is great for black. Black has slight advantage. So black has an exchange down, but look at the pair of nice bishops, first of all, and look at the bishop on d4, which attacks b2 and literally closes the position. And we know that the only way to prove the advantage of the rook against the minor piece is to have open files. It's really a problem for white here. So this is about bishop to d3. As you may notice, after that, black is having a dark play against d4 pawn. So let's get back to the most critical test. It is e5 move. So in this position, white is trying to play e5. You're maybe wondering what's the difference compared to the move e5 one move earlier. So after taking on e5, again, white is just capturing the f pawn. The previous line actually suggested to play knight to d5, occupying this nice square, but now it's not really cool because in this case, as you can see, we didn't play bishop to e6 and our position is not that solid hands. So white may try bishop to g5, attacking the queen, and since the queen has to protect the knight, most likely it is forced to not very good square on d7, or maybe black is just playing something like knight to c3, an intermediate capture, but that is exactly what white wants to get here, because after b takes c3, well, there is no longer a problem with the d4, and white has very nice pawns, controlling a lot. For instance, queen may go to d5, active move, but then white continues with the bishop to d3, developing the bishop and exerting some pressure on h7, and it may go wrong for black rather quickly. For example, if black plays bishop to g4 here, pinning the knight, white continues with the attack against h7 directly. So black doesn't want to play something like g6 because it will weaken all the dark squares around the king. Instead, black may probably try h6, but then white has pretty annoying sacrifice. It is simple bishop captures on h6. It is a long-term sacrifice, I mean the sacrifice for long-term compensation. After g takes h6, queen goes to d2, as simple as that, just attacking h6 pawn. But not only that, so after queen to c6, let's say, simply protecting the pawn on h6 and controlling other critical squares like c3 and so on, white simply castles. And look at this position. So yeah, black is a minor piece up, but the pawn structure is completely damaged here on the king side. And one of the key defenders that could really help to cover dark squares, at least, around the king, is far away, and there is no chance for black to bring it to the king side in time, which means white has an amazing initiative here. For example, after knight to d7 move, queen simply goes to f4, getting closer and closer, and it's going to be really hard for black to survive it. That's why after f takes e5, moving the knight to d5 in these new conditions is not so good. Instead, black may try a surprising move, rook to e8. So let's get back to it. So here, black may try to pin the pawn e5 with the move rook to e8. It doesn't look like a very reliable defense because white is going to change the situation rather quickly. I mean, with this pin along the e-file, it feels like the knight f6 will be forced to go somewhere anyway, in one or two moves. But it's not that simple as it looks at the first glance. So the most natural try for white here is to develop the bishop on g5, just to pin the knight, ensuring that it doesn't go whenever the problem with the pin on the e-file is solved. So after bishop to g5, black also responds with a similar thing, moving the bishop to g4 and pinning the knight on f3, and hence fighting against d4 pawn. And after bishop to e2, which looks very natural, now taking on f6 is an actual threat, black may try a Gambit knight to c6 move. So after knight to c6, we may notice that d4 is under pressure, and black is actually allowing the capture on f6. And this works just well for black if white accepts this sacrifice. Let's have a look at that. So e takes f6, taking the knight at first glance for nothing because it doesn't feel like black has really dangerous attack, but black does. Knight captures on d4 now, exerting additional pressure on the bishop on e2 as well as the knight on f3. And now we have different options. Let's start with the most straightforward one. What happens if white captures on d4? In this case, we recapture with the bishop, creating a simple threat of just taking on c3 with check and then winning the bishop on e2. And king f1 doesn't really help because after bishop captures on c3, white cannot take the bishop on g4, unfortunately. So let's say if bishop takes g4, then simple rook to e1, bishop c3 controls that square. And even though white gets some material for queen after rook e1, bishop e1, and rook to e1, everything is being destroyed rather quickly because white doesn't have his pieces coordinated here. Queen goes to d3 now with check, and the problem is clear, I suppose. So if, for example, bishop goes back, there is queen to f5 check, winning the bishop g5. If the king goes somewhere to g1, let's say, we may play simple queen to d4 check and take the bishop. Finally, if king goes to f2, there is an interesting way to win the material here. Simply queen to g6, skewering these guys on g5 and g4. And after the only sensible defense h4, black may simply take on f6, winning the bishop and hence having the material advantage as a result. So taking on g4 is impossible, but taking a queen is also not so helpful. So let's have a look at that situation. Let's say white decides to take the queen here, but instead of taking the queen, of course, black starts with check. So bishop captures on e2, forcing the king to f2, and only after that, black is taking on d8. It's clear that white can regain the missing piece here, taking on c3, but black is already a pawn up, and the activity of the pieces is simply beyond compare. Everything is clear that only black can win this game. Okay, So let's switch to the other line. So instead of taking on d4, white may try king to f1 move. But after that, black may develop a strong initiative even in the endgame stage. So knight captures on e2, surprisingly giving white a chance to exchange queens, but it doesn't change anything for white. Queen takes d8, rook takes d8. Now the knight captures on e2. So pay attention, white is a minor piece up in the endgame, but the pieces are so badly placed that black has a serious initiative here. So, for example, black plays bishop to f5, creating a serious threat of just moving the bishop to d3, and it's not so simple for white to parry that. For example, if f captures g7, again, the most straightforward continuation, then bishop simply goes to d3, attacking the knight. It's a serious threat, because after taking on e2, the king will be forced to e1, there will be a discovered check, and so on. Black will simply start collecting the material. So white has to protect it with the rook to e1 move, but then rook captures on e2, rook captures on e2, so the rook is pinned now, and it's quite vulnerable here. Black continues with the obvious rook to e8, continuing with the attack against it, and after the only sensible defense, knight to g1, black simply eliminates this defender with the bishop takes g1 move, and after something like king to g1 and rook captures on e2. As you can see, white doesn't have time even to protect b2 pawn, because there is a threat of rook e1 winning the rook. So white has to make some room for king, but then rook captures on b2, and only black has chances to win the game in this situation. So another possibility is to play knight to f4. Let's have a look at that one. So what if white is trying just to go away from that pin, controlling d3 square at the same time? It appears there are not so many good squares. Well, if knight simply goes away somewhere, not controlling d3, bishop d3 comes with check, winning the game, because the king will be checkmated, almost checkmated, of course. But after knight to f4, well, black plays something else. It's just h6. It appears that the bishop is actually limited with the own pawn here, and now it's forced to h4, where after black plays g5, regaining the material. Once the material is regained, black's position is simply overwhelming. Finally, if white starts with the h4 move here, just creating a room for some pieces, protecting the bishop, whatever, black continues with the normal bishop to d3, because that was basically the idea behind this move, and after rook to e1 and h6, attacking the bishop, forcing the bishop to a less active position, let's say bishop to f4, rook takes e2 comes again. So the idea we have seen already, rook captures on e2, rook goes to e8. After that, the only defense is knight to g1. Well, in this situation, obviously, white has a better version of what we had before, but it's still super ugly. So rook captures on e2. Black is already a pawn up. b2 is hanging, f6 is hanging. There are different threats like bishop e4 potentially. Once again, only black has chances in this situation. So as we can see, it's not so good to accept the sacrifice of the knight, but even castling is not really helpful. So let's have a look at it. For instance, after castling, black may take the knight on f3. So in other words, to eliminate the only real defender of the d4 pawn, and after bishop captures on f3, black simply captures d4 with check first, and after king goes away, bishop takes on e5, winning 2 pawns in a row. Obviously, white will have some compensation because of the activity of the pieces, probably because of the bishops and the character of the position, so it's rather open. But anyway, 2 pawns are 2 pawns. This position is the position with the clear advantage for black. So let's switch to bishop e2 line. White may want to avoid pinning the knight on f6 and make another natural move. It is bishop to e2, which at first glance creates a threat of taking the knight on f6. But as we have already understood, it's not so clear. I mean, there are some positions in which taking the knight on f6 is not so good. So again, black may exploit this motive and play bishop to g4, leaving the knight on f6 hanging. And after e takes f6, which looks natural, because what else actually? The knight is under attack and hence d4 is super vulnerable. So e captures f6, black continues in a very natural way, knight to c6, so not actually forcing anything at first glance, but in fact attacking the key pawn, it is d4. Now if white castles, which looks like the most natural reply, black simply captures on d4 with the knight, and after knight takes d4, queen takes d4 check, and king to h1, black is simply regaining the material, like bishop takes e2, knight captures e2, queen takes queen, and after this exchange, the knight drops. Once again, leaving black with extra pawn and more active pieces placement. So castling is hence not so good. Let's see the other options. What can be played except for, castling here? Well, it may be just moving the king away from the e-file because it is extremely vulnerable there, and hence the bishop is quite vulnerable. So king may go to f1 here, but it doesn't really change the character of the position. Although white has some nice options here to fight, well, no surprises for a draw. The black is actually developing a very strong initiative here, and white may want to start thinking about equalizing chances. So one of the options here for black is to take the pawn on f6. Again, as simple as that. Preparing knight captures d4. Now the knight is pinned along the f-file. And right now, white plays knight to d5. This move has different ideas, maybe to eliminate the bishop, which is quite active. Another idea may be to bring the knight to f4 to help the king. The point is, after queen to g6, which looks pretty natural, just relocating the queen somewhere to a more active position, white is in trouble. Although it doesn't look like black has a crushing attack, but give black one or two moves and everything will be pretty understandable. So let's say this rook may go to d8 pretty soon, then there will be a problem with the d4 pawn, and white is just not developed yet. So white has to decide right now how to diffuse the pressure, and one of the possibilities is to play bishop to d3, attacking the queen, first moving the bishop away from the e-file, and after queen to h5 to play knight to f4. So if white decides to do something else, for example, knight to e3, then after knight captures d4, black still has an amazing initiative, although the quantity of material involved is being reduced. So knight captures on g4, queen takes g4. Pay attention how black is attacking with pieces, no pawns involved. Bishop may go to d2, let's say, just completing the development. And then black is just relocating the knight to f5, intending to do different things, including simple rook a to d8, attacking bishops along the d-file, maybe intending to go to e3 at some point, maybe even with the rook. So anything may happen here. And there are different options, but let's have a look at, let's say, knight to g5, intending to exchange queens here and reduce this amazing pressure. It simply doesn't work because of the queen d4 move. So it is another interesting idea for black here, just creating a threat of queen f2, attacking the bishop at the same time. So something like queen f3 may be played, but then knight to e3 check, bishop captures, and prior to taking anything on e3, black eliminates the bishop with check and then takes the bishop on e3. It's basically over. So let's get back to the main line, and now it becomes clear that, well, even though this position doesn't look so complicated, it actually hides a lot of interesting opportunities for black in order to attack. As you can see, even though this position doesn't look super complicated, it gives black amazing opportunities in the sense of developing the initiative and attack against the king. So white should rather try knight to f4 here, attacking the queen. And if black wants to save this active position, he or she might want to put the queen on h6. But in this case, white has a chance to finish the game with a perpetual. So like knight to g6, attacking the queen with the bishop from c1. As you can see, this knight is supported by the bishop, so black cannot take it with the queen. And after queen goes to h5, white may repeat the position. And hence, this one is more or less balanced. So as a general conclusion, as you can see, this line starts slowly, but then may quickly escalate. I guess if white plays this c3 and d4 thing, it may give black really good chances to grab the initiative, in fact, but black should be ready to play a minor piece down, actually sacrificing the material. For white, I guess it's better to avoid all this, because it's all are unnecessary complications, and it's much better to switch to Vienna, which is like King's Gambit, slightly different, but the spirit is more or less the same. So I would recommend white to play bishop c4 thing against black's bishop c5 followed by d6. It's the most logical continuation. And for black, well, if you face a true King's Gambit player, which is going to actually stay inside the King's Gambit and play c3 and d4, okay, here you have an interesting possibility to grab the initiative. I hope you found this material interesting and useful. In the next video, we are going to discuss the Falkbear counter gambit. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye.